want to thank all of you for attending tonight. It's great to see so many people interested in taking action on climate change. In my view, it's the most pressing issue affecting our Earth because it has such sprawling impacts on every aspect of life: the economy, immigration, health, education, housing, social and environmental justice, everything that has a part in our quality of life. So again, I appreciate your interest, and I hope you gain some insight into how you can get involved and affect change to the trajectory of climate impacts. As part of this series, Northern Nevada Marches Forward is bringing together volunteers, organizations, and activists toward common goals of inclusivity and equity, with a mission to support and uplift the voices and power of diverse people and communities to create transformative social change. Our guests this evening are Brian Thornton and Michelle Hamilton with Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a nonpartisan grassroots nonprofit organization with a mission to build political will for a livable world. They train and support volunteers who advocate for fair, effective, and sustainable climate change solutions. One of the things that we like to do is begin with a land acknowledgement, acknowledging that the land we are on is previously managed and lived on by Indigenous peoples of the Great Basin. It is our responsibility to honor Indigenous peoples of the Great Basin. In the South, we honor the Southern Paiutes by their name, the Nuwubi. In the North, from Pyramid Lake to the Mojave Desert, the Numu, the Northern Paiutes, take pride with the pupfish, trout, and kuyuli. Extending from Death Valley to the Ruby Mountains and beyond are the ancestral lands of the Western Shoshone and Goshutes. Throughout the high desert to the alpine areas of Tahoe, the Washoe stories center around their beautiful lake. All Indigenous peoples have place names that were trade routes and areas dedicated for gathering, hunting, and healing. Indigenous peoples continue to have access to honor songs and prayers that bring a balance and an indebtedness to protecting the lands, wildlife, and waters against sickness. We honor Indigenous teachings and the continued protection we seek for our Earth Mother. Just a quick reminder to make sure that you're muted for this presentation so you don't have a lot of background noise, and a brief reminder to please put your questions in the chat, or once our speakers have finished, we'll have a Q&A session. And Brian and Michelle will also pop the Citizens Climate Lobby website and their email addresses in the chat if you'd like to get in touch with them further. I'm going to turn it over to Brian and Michelle now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tina, for that wonderful introduction. When we were talking earlier today, I was struck by one of the things that Citizens Climate Lobby, or CCL as we like to refer to ourselves, shares in common with Northern Nevada Marches Forward, and that's the desire to turn passion into action. And so that's what I'm hoping we can do here today. As CCL volunteers, Brian and I have learned a lot about climate change over the years, but we're not experts. We are parents, deeply concerned about the world we're leaving behind for our children. And Brian has made a career in energy efficiency and green buildings. So we'd like to share with you some of the things we've learned and some resources that have been helpful to us. We've got a lot of information, and we've got some time for you to create your own plan built into this time today. So it might be helpful to have something to write with. Please feel free to share your thoughts in the chat, and we'll okay, to begin, we'll follow that with an exercise to imagine a world where we've stopped emitting greenhouse gases. And to help us with this, we're going to listen to an audio clip that first aired on Citizens Climate Radio. You're going to hear the voice of Sean Daig, who's going to help us imagine a decarbonized world. So please engage all your senses in this thought exercise. I am going to share my screen here.
So one of the things that I found really useful in talking with people is getting them to think about what this world looks like once we've decarbonized it, once we've stopped using fossil fuels. Just start with your day, right? You open your door and you walk out your door, and what's different? What looks different than you've seen before, right? So you got a car in your driveway, and And something we know is different is that car is not going to have a tailpipe anymore. What else is different? You're not going to use fossil fuels to heat your home. Houses aren't going to have chimneys. Where we get our electricity from is going to be different. There's going to be no smokestacks on power plants. And if you take those three things, just starting there, you can start to think about, well, what else does that mean? When we take the tailpipes off cars, that means that we're not emitting all of this funky pollution, 6 inches off the ground. And that's a big part of what sort of city smell is. Like the cities literally smell differently at that point. You close your eyes, the flowers in bloom, the tree blossoms are going to be things that come much more to the forefront because they're not covered in all this other pollution. The horizon changes color. As we stop putting pollution in the air, you won't get the haze on the horizons like you do now. It's going to sound different. The difference between an electric vehicle and a gasoline one driving up the street is huge. And you start multiplying this as you get into these denser city environments, and this whole din of our industry today goes away. And when that drops out, what are you hearing instead? What other voices or noises come to the forefront? Like, what more of nature can you hear?
Thank you. It's really important for us to be able to imagine the world that we're moving towards. And to build that world, we need to decarbonize. So let's talk about how we're going to do that. I am going to share my slides with you now. All right, and I'll get that out of the way. Okay. So in 1988, when the world community of climate scientists started getting alarmed about climate change, the United Nations formed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a mouthful. So it's also known as the IPCC. And the job of the IPCC is to study the science and make recommendations. You may have heard that they just released their 6th report. Each report has sounded the alarm. Global warming is real. It's caused by rapidly increasing greenhouse gas emissions. Human activity is causing almost all of the increase. The most recent report paints an alarming picture of serious, widespread damage to human and ecological health that will get worse unless we take serious action now. So what we're looking at here is a picture of different possible futures, depending on what we do. The scale on the left is measuring greenhouse gas emissions. And the black line on the left shows historical emissions starting in the year 2000. On the right, we see different futures. The top scenario shows where we would have been before the policies countries put into place in 2015. That is not the world we want to live in. Just below that is the current situation, the dire situation where global temperatures increase 3.1 degrees Celsius. We're already seeing the impact, and it's going to get worse. The bottom blue pathway is where we want to be if we want to limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius and avoid the worst damage. So we must reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The IPCC makes it crystal clear that we've got a long way to go to get out of this crisis. But the report also shows that we've made progress. We're not at the top of this picture anymore. And we have the tools we need to tackle this crisis. Mary McNamara, who's a columnist at the LA Times, recently wrote a piece with the headline, "The only thing we should be talking about is the climate crisis." And in it, she says, the first thing we need to do is stop using the term climate change, which makes the situation seem relatively benign and natural, as if the Earth were entering menopause, and all those scientists just want us to know that hot flashes can be expected. No, no, no. The man-made shift they are predicting will cause a large number of humans to regularly die by heat, fire, water, drought, and famine. The IPCC is sounding the alarm. So today, we're going to use the term climate crisis. So how are we doing in the US? Unfortunately, our greenhouse gas emissions are basically flat, as you can see here. In other words, we are nowhere near zero. The top of this graphic shows the different types of greenhouse gases. These numbers come from the US EPA's inventory of 2019 US greenhouse gas emissions. Below that, we can answer the question, where do all these greenhouse gas emissions come from anyway? Most of it comes from fossil fuels. 29% comes from transportation. That's trucks, cars, buses, planes. 25% comes from generating electricity from coal and natural gas. 23% comes from industrial processes, and the rest comes from agriculture and buildings. So how much direct control do you and I have over greenhouse gas emissions? Only about 40%. That means 60% is embedded in our system. And that's a little daunting because to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we have to reshape our economy, our government policies, and our habits and choices. But make no mistake, individuals alone will not solve this problem. And don't be fooled by fossil fuel firms who have spent billions of dollars to deny the climate crisis and shift responsibility onto consumers for decades. If you want to see some of those old ads, which I'm sure you'll recognize, or learn more about their disinformation campaigns, then check out the links in the chat. Greenhouse gas emissions vary a lot between different parts of our world, and so do the impacts of climate change. They vary between rich and poor countries. So for example, the average American emits 4 times the global average greenhouse gas emissions per year. They vary between rich and poor households, where households in the top quintile have 4 times the greenhouse gas emissions of the lowest quintile. And they vary between largely white and BIPOC communities. UNLV put out a report that showed neighborhoods exposed to extreme heat are disproportionately poor and people of color. The top 10 cities with the strongest correlation between heat and income includes Las Vegas and North Las Vegas. So that was a lot to absorb, and I'd like everybody to take a breath while you ask yourself how you're feeling about all this. I'm going to read a sentence and I want you to fill in the blank. If you're comfortable, type it in the chat. When I think about the climate crisis, I feel what? What do you feel? Be honest with yourself. When I think about the climate crisis, I feel hopeless. Yeah, I felt that way after the IPCC report came out. Sometimes I just feel angry, overwhelmed. Yep, definitely been there. Despair, yes, especially when I talk to my kids. Small and unable to make a difference. Helpless. Oh, I can empathize with all these emotions. Like I'm doing what I can, but I feel it's nearly insurmountable on a global stage. Yeah, this is hard. This is really hard. I'm going to read to you a quote from the book, Active Hope. Terrified. Yeah, I've been there too. Laughter is how I deal with my stress. So the subtitle of the book is How to Face the Mess We're In Without Going Crazy. And it's written by Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone. So here's what they have to say. Our world is heating up. Deserts are expanding, and extreme weather events are becoming more common. Human population and consumption are increasing, while essential resources like fresh water, fish stocks, and topsoil are in decline. Given these adversities, it is no surprise if we experience a profound loss of confidence in the future. Because it is considered too depressing to talk about, it tends to remain an unspoken presence in the backs of our minds. And when we do face the problem, it can feel overwhelming. So we now acknowledge that our times confront us with realities that are painful to face, difficult to take in, and confusing to live with. Every social issue is made worse by the climate crisis. Housing, immigration, racism, and so many others. We need tools to strengthen us on this journey. Tools like community, like the gathering we are having here this evening. And the book Active Hope is about coping with these strong emotions and building the strength to do this work over the long haul. And we'll drop their website in the chat. Remember that hope is an action. You are not alone. The Yale program on climate change communication and the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University have been tracking attitudes about climate change for over a decade. And the data we're looking at here is from 2015 to 2050. And what you can see at the top is that the percent of people who dismiss climate change is small and shrinking. Whereas if you look at the bottom, those who are concerned or alarmed over climate change, they're increasing. And in fact, the majority of people are either alarmed or concerned. So you are not alone. Do you talk about your concerns? Do you talk about the climate crisis? Most Americans rarely or never discuss the climate crisis, even though concern is rising. We tend to self-silence. I don't want to get into a fight about this. It's too thing. I don't know enough. Nobody feels like me. Do these sound familiar? I've definitely said these things. Silence is a problem. Studies show that just talking about climate change leads to greater acceptance of climate science. The more we talk about it, the more we normalize our collective understanding that this is a serious problem that most of us are concerned about. So try having one additional conversation about the climate crisis in the next week. It doesn't have to be a confrontation. Try starting with the values you share with the other person, like protecting the people and places you love. You could simply express concern about the climate crisis, or you could mention a recent news story about the climate crisis. There are a lot to choose from. And there's no doubt that some people are harder to talk to than others. If you have someone like that in your life, then we recommend the book Cranky Uncle by John Cook. There's also an app, and he's got a website. We'll drop that info in the chat. So we need to talk about the climate crisis more. Do we make it a voting issue? Unfortunately, lots of environmentalists don't vote. 15.78 million environmentalists did not vote in 2014. In 2016, 10 million registered voters named the environment as their top priority, but did not vote. And this is more than the number of votes that won the last presidential election, which was only 7 million. Keep in mind that when politicians take the pulse of their constituents, they only poll likely voters. If voters aren't demanding environmental leadership, politicians have little incentive to do something about the climate crisis. And remember that we have to change the system we're living in. This is a voting year. We must elect climate champions who will tackle the climate crisis and make it a priority to establish laws that get us to net zero. If they don't have a plan, they are not looking out for the future of our children. So call, write, meet with legislators at all levels of government. Join committees or working groups if you have the time. Write letters to the editor. Follow leaders on social media if you're on social media, and engage with what they have to say. I made my first phone call to one of our senators about 2 years ago, and I have to tell you that I was absolutely terrified. And when I made the call, the person who answered the phone was polite. They were a good listener. They listened carefully to what I had to say. They wrote it down and they thanked me for calling. It was so easy that it made it much easier for me to pick up the phone the next time. So Brian is dropping a link in the chat for a campaign that you can join today. This is an easy way to tell President Biden and our legislators that the climate crisis is important. This tool will offer some suggested text, but it's really much more powerful if you update the subject line and message text to reflect your own voice. And keep in mind that the White House actually prefers getting emails. It's easier for them to track. Psychologists tell us that doing something consistent with our values is motivating and empowering. That's definitely been my experience with Citizens Climate Lobby. Action helps me to deal with climate anxiety. Joining a group is empowering. Not only are we more effective when we work together, but these communities can support us when the going gets tough. And this is tough going. So here's a list of some large climate groups. There are others. Check them out at the upcoming Earth Day event on April 24th from 11 to 5 at Idlewild Park. And Brian's going to drop the link in the chat. As Tina mentioned, Brian and I volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby. And as CCL volunteers, we advocate for carbon pricing, which is the single most effective policy to reduce emissions. The most recent IPCC report points out that carbon pricing is effective and efficient, not only in theory, but also in practice, because there are other countries in the world that have carbon pricing. So let's find out more about this policy.
Like many Americans, you might know that climate change is a crisis. The main drive is carbon dioxide emissions, a result of burning fossil fuels. We need to reduce our emissions as fast as possible. This is a huge challenge. Our society runs on energy systems that produce emissions. Fees on carbon pollution would encourage businesses to provide lower carbon alternatives of all your favorite things. But how can we do that without increasing the financial burden on Americans? What if carbon fee proceeds were distributed to all households? Well, exactly such a policy is in Congress. Say hello to cashback carbon pricing. Here's how it works. The government charges a fee on fossil fuels as they enter the economy at the oil well, coal mine, or port. The funds are then distributed equally to all Americans. Money in your bank account, much like a stimulus check. This protects you from price increases. You choose how to spend your cash. If you reduce your carbon use by riding a bike, upgrading your electricity system, and many other ways, you keep more of your money. This chart shows how cashback carbon pricing will work for you. The more we consume, the more carbon we release. Here, lowest earners are on the left, with the highest spenders on the right. Each column shows the net cash benefit at various income levels. Everyone in green, 7 out of 10 households gain financially on day one with this policy. In fact, the lowest earners will see their income rise materially, while the highest earners' cost increase is bearable. For the first time, we'd have climate policy that aligns the interests of everyday Americans and businesses with meaningful climate action. In this fractured political moment, it's a rare policy that works for all Americans. What's more, it would halve U.S. emissions by 2030 and drive us towards net zero by 2050. You might be wondering why you haven't heard of this breakthrough policy. We were too. The truth is, it mostly benefits citizens, so it's up to us to spread the word. Let's demand that our elected officials give us cashback carbon pricing. Visit Citizens Climate Lobby and EnergyInnovationAct.org.
All right. So if you're interested in learning more about Citizens Climate Lobby, or if you want to tell your legislator to put carbon pricing in place, then Brian has dropped some links in the chat. So we've covered a lot of ground at this point, and I want to pause and reflect. Have you found a way to face the mess we're in without going crazy? Are you talking about climate change enough? Is climate change a voting issue for you? Which climate group have you joined? Can you step up your involvement? And I'm going to go on mute and give you just a minute to think about your answers and come up with your own plan on this.
Everybody can feel free to pop some answers and thoughts in the chat. I know it's a big issue to think about.
All right. Thank you for taking some time to reflect on how to build strength and how to join others to tackle the climate crisis. Even though individuals alone will not solve the problem, we have to change the system. Still, our choices and habits matter. To live in a decarbonized world, everyone will need to adapt and make changes. So in this section, Brian will help us look at the things we can do to reduce our own carbon footprint.
Brian, you're muted.
Thank you, Michelle. Let's talk about our carbon footprints now. We can't change the world completely just by changing our own habits, but I don't know about you, but for me, taking those first steps is a good way to become empowered to get more involved. We've heard, I think, in the news that China now has the highest total greenhouse gas emissions, but the US is still #2, and with an average of about 16 tons of CO2 equivalent per person, the US remains by far the highest per person, over twice that of China. Also, the US has released more greenhouse gases to date than any other country. And as Americans, we have a special responsibility to work on this problem. Carbon footprint varies by household and typically increases substantially as income increases. This graph shows typical carbon footprint for an average household of 2 to 3 people and shows substantial increases for higher income. It also gives a simple breakdown by major categories such as food, housing, and transportation. If your income is lower, your footprint is likely smaller and your efforts may be better focused on political involvement, like Michelle talked about, rather than worrying as much about your own emissions. So how do you figure out what your carbon footprint is? There are lots of sources online. If you do a Google search, you'll find many of them. You can also just do a general estimate using something like the graph on the previous page to get some idea. There are more detailed tools like the Cool Climate Project Calculator, which we'll put a link in the chat for. And that tool can be used both to do a quick, simple estimate, as well as getting really specific on your own usage. The point of these calculators and tools is not to feel guilty about what you've done, but rather to gain a deeper understanding so you know what to focus on. It's easy to think, well, if I do this one little thing, it'll make a big difference, but this will allow you to focus on the really big things. Before we look at that tool, I'd like to talk just a little bit about some definitions. So with our greenhouse gas emissions, there's kind of the direct emissions from burning things like gasoline in a car. And then there's the indirect emissions, and that's what we also call embodied carbon. And that is all of the energy and the transportation and the disposal impacts for all the products we buy and the services we use. One useful source for exploring this is a book called How Bad Are Bananas by Michael Berners-Lee. By the way, bananas aren't that bad, so you don't have to give up bananas tomorrow. So let's take a quick tour of the Cool Climate Calculator. Across the top, there are 6 main tabs. The screen that is shown here is the Get Started tab. But as you look across, there's travel, which is all your transportation, home, which is energy, food and shopping, where you enter most of your household usage data if you decide to do a detailed input. The last tab, Take Action, has some great ideas for reducing your footprint and has some details about the impact of different choices. On the chart on the right, above the chart, there is a total annual carbon footprint that would come out from your inputs, or there's also a default that starts out. On the right, those results are shown initially with those default values. On the chart itself, you'll see that some of the boxes don't have a label. That's just because the boxes are too small, but you can see those by hovering over those boxes. It'll reveal the name of it as well as the quantity in numbers of your outputs. So this tool can be used in two different ways. The easiest way is to get just a general estimate that is a little bit more specific for your household, and you only need to enter 3 values: your location, your city or zip code, the number of people in your household, and your gross household income. And then it uses some internal default values to put that in terms of your specific household. If you want to take the time and look deeper and see how you vary from a typical household, you can do those other inputs for things like transportation and your food and home. It does take a little time, but it's an interesting exercise, and you can always leave a default if something seems too complicated. So what this tool tells us is where our biggest impacts are. So for example, in this default chart, the things that really stand out are the direct emissions from things like car fuel, natural gas, that could also be heating oil for heating our homes, and also on the direct emission side is air travel. For an average person, air travel isn't as big a deal as it seems to come out in the media, but if you're traveling a lot for business and fun, then that may be your biggest category. And then you'll see electricity and meat. And electricity, there is an impact, but the beauty of that with electricity is we can substitute renewable electricity for that. And we'll talk about that in a little while. And then on food, typically meat is the big category, and we'll get into that in a little more detail as well. On the right, there are things that are just all the goods and services that we buy. Those are harder to control. Those are the things that Michelle talked about. We need to change the whole economy to change. There are some things we can do, and we'll get into those a little bit, but those are not necessarily your immediate focus. The good news is that embodied carbon in those types of things is going down as we shift to renewable electricity. So everything we buy will have a lower carbon footprint as the systems change. So your footprint may not look exactly like this, but you can still use this technique to find the things that are big for you and focus on those. So let's take a minute here and think about a plan or what you could work on or things to think about with your own carbon footprint. Do you want to run a carbon calc or just use a general estimate? How does your carbon footprint compare to the typical Reno household? Will you have a bigger impact if you engage politically? Maybe your impact is, maybe you've already got an electric car and a heat pump. Which category can you work on today? Is there something you can do immediately over the next year or over the next 5 years? We have not done all of the changes that we'd like to do. Some of them are going to take more time and cost more money. So I'll pause a moment here and let you reflect. And feel free to share anything you've done or learned in the chat. There are some interesting thoughts in the chat. I'm going to address one of them, which is the idea that our individual efforts don't have a substantial impact. There's some truth to that, but the reality is too that we all are going to have to shift the energy source for our cars or bikes, move to bikes, or all those things do matter. I mean, the system has to change, but if none of us adopt heat pumps, none of us buy electric cars, then all the government policies in the world won't get us there. So it's a combination. Individual efforts do matter.
Yeah, if I could just add on to that, there's definitely a phenomenon where once a solar panel goes on the roof of a neighborhood, then other neighbors will see that and they'll talk to somebody that they actually know, and the instances of solar panels on roofs in that neighborhood will actually go up.
All right, so one of the big things we saw in the Cool Climate Calculator was car fuel. And that's really usually the biggest impact for anybody that's using a gasoline or diesel powered car. So let's talk a little bit about that. The biggest way to address that is to electrify your ride. And the best choice in some respects is an electric bike or electric moped or motorcycle, just because they're so light and have even lower emissions. Obviously, most of us are interested in cars as well, and there are all electric cars. Switching to electricity will greatly reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, particularly here in Nevada, because our system is mostly natural gas with a substantial part already in renewable electricity. Only in a few places in the US where they are still mostly dependent on coal is there a less clear trade-off. Once you convert to electricity for your transportation, you can then go a step further and go to all renewable electricity. And we'll talk a little more about that. That will pretty much eliminate the carbon footprint for your transportation. I've also included here a plug-in hybrid car. Those have a plug-in electric battery. It can do most of your local travel on the battery, but they still have a small gasoline motor. And the value of this type of vehicle is, like, you have to spend a lot of time in rural Nevada where you might not have access to a car charger. But when you're in town and driving locally, which is usually half of people's driving, you can still get around. We have a 2013 plug-in hybrid, and we're planning to move to an all-electric in the coming year as well. So there's a lot of really great information on electric and hybrid vehicles, as well as fuel-efficient vehicles, at an EPA website that Michelle is going to put into the chat. To look at this a little bit further, this chart shows on the left the emissions per 1,000 miles driven, and that's the height of the orange bars. And on the right, the cost for energy in the form of gas and or electricity across the top. These numbers are a little bit out of date given the price of gasoline now. So the reality is you would save even more switching to electricity. Across the bottom, there's a range of vehicles all the way from a 20 mile per gallon truck or SUV through to hybrid cars getting 50 miles per gallon, and electric vehicles like a Tesla or a other car, and then motorcycles. And then finally, all the way down here where you can barely see the impact is an electric bicycle. So the further to the right, the lighter, the more electric you could go, the better. And you will not only greatly reduce your carbon footprint, you'll save money. Now, these values for the electricity are for home charging. If you don't have access to home charging, you may pay more for the electricity at public charging and other commercial charging stations. These values too assume you're getting your electricity from the grid. If you actually have access to renewable energy, then you basically eliminate almost all of your carbon footprint, except for the embodied carbon of the system. So we've taken care of our transportation carbon footprint. Let's now talk about our homes. Now, if you rent or are part of a COA or something where you don't have direct control over your home, some of these things are going to be less applicable to you. There are some things you can do, which we'll touch on a bit later. So I suggest to start with, you do some sort of energy assessment. NB Energy provides a basic one for free, which we'll touch on. Reduce your heating and cooling needs before trying to go to different equipment, because that will reduce the cost of a new heat pump or something. One of the biggest ones is typically attic insulation. Consider replacing your windows if you've got old aluminum windows. And then consider air sealing, which is relatively inexpensive and can have a big impact to seal your ducts and things like that. Once you've taken some of those steps, then it makes sense to look at eliminating natural gas or heating oil by replacing a furnace with a heat pump. And there are cold climate heat pumps now that work great in our climate. They operate down to -5 to -15 degrees, -13 degrees, depending on the type of equipment. You might need a little bit of electric backup heat, but they basically run just great in the winter. So you can do that for your main heating source. You can also get what's called a heat pump water heater to eliminate a gas water heater, or more simply, just a basic electric resistance water heater. And then if you have a gas fireplace or other gas heaters or a gas stove, there are good electric options for those as well. Radiant electric heaters, electric stoves, modern electric stoves work great. The other thing about gas stoves is recent information is showing that the indoor air pollution from those is substantial. So it's really good to look to switch those to electric for health reasons. And then, again, if you've done all this to move to electricity, you've still got a carbon footprint because the natural gas power plant is running, but you can switch to renewable electricity. We'll talk about that next. Michelle's going to put in the chat a Rewiring America about electrifying your home. All right, so there's two ways to switch to renewable electricity. It turns out that Northern Nevada has what's called their Green Energy Choice Program, and they offer the option of using 100% or 50% renewable energy by paying a surcharge on your monthly bill per kilowatt hour used. That program is quite robust. The NV Energy is not allowed to use that renewable energy for any other purpose. They can't claim that as part of their portfolio standard. So there is an additional benefit. And if enough people sign up, they need to use that energy or that money to support the development of new renewables projects. So if we could get everybody in Nevada to sign up for this program, we would immediately force NV Energy to switch to renewable electricity. Michelle's putting a link in the chat for that program. If you go to it, you can sign up online or you can call customer service if you have questions. Be patient. Sometimes the customer service folks don't know about the program, so you might have to get to the right person. That program is a good choice. It's also worth exploring whether it makes sense for you to put your own solar panels up on your house. There are lots of contractors around that can help you with that. There are lease programs where you can spread the cost out over time. So that's another option as well. So we've looked at transportation in our homes. One of the other big categories is diet. And as I mentioned, and as this pie chart shows, meat and dairy are the big impacts. And then looking more specifically, this chart talks about the amount of greenhouse gas emissions for specific foods. And beef is by far the biggest impact. And that's because of all the inputs that go into creating beef, but also because cows, when they digest, give off methane and other greenhouse gases. And so people are working on that. There are perhaps in the long term ways to mitigate that, but currently beef is by far the biggest impact. Cheese is also pretty high because of the amount of milk that goes into it, and again, the cows in the production. So consider cutting back on those things. Add more beans, lentils, nuts, grilled veggies, and mushrooms, and those can help replace some of the tastes and textures and the protein in meats. Or consider lowering the carbon footprint of the meats that you choose. Pork, chicken, and eggs are not nearly as high as beef. You don't have to become a vegetarian overnight if you aren't already. Just start gradually trying some other things. So some of the things we talked about, are hard to do if you live in an apartment, or they cost more money and take time. There are also a lot of simple things you can do. You can just drive less and walk less, bike, bus, carpool, and we have this great new technology for online meetings, which we can use. If you do drive a gasoline-powered or diesel-powered vehicle, learn how to be more efficient with it. You can improve your miles per gallon 15 to 30% with some relatively straightforward habits and changes. Michelle's going to put the Eco Driver's Manual link online, which has a lot of great tips on that. And there are many, many home energy reduction things you can do. And many of these are doable even if you're in an apartment. And the biggest one is just to adjust your thermostat to run a little cooler in the winter and put on a sweater and let it be a little warmer in the summer and dress down. NV Energy has a great list of these. And as I mentioned, at this website that we're going to put in the chat, you can get a free energy assessment from NV Energy and some other freebies, as well as lots of low-cost tips, things that cost a little more to do, and et cetera. And then, as we talked about, goods and services can be the biggest part of our carbon footprint because of embodied energy. So we just want to think about what we're spending, use what you have, buy used, consider the energy usage of things, get a rake instead of a leaf blower, and consider looking at the companies that you're buying from. Some of them these days are making claims about, using all 100% renewable energy. So there are a lot of good options out there. And then finally, what a lot of modern sociology and psychology research shows us that stuff doesn't necessarily make us happy once we get above a certain level. What does is the people in our lives. So focus on friends and family. There are many, many, many ideas online about this. We're going to put a link to a living a more sustainable lifestyle that has 100 ideas on this in this direction. So there are a lot of things we can do to reduce our carbon footprint, but it's nearly impossible to eliminate it. So one of the things you can then do, and you can do this now, is to buy what are called individual carbon offsets. A carbon offset allows you to pay money to a group or an organization to reduce greenhouse gases elsewhere and offset the greenhouse gases that you're producing. And these programs typically invest the money in renewable energy projects, energy efficiency, destruction of pollutants from landfills or other sources, and tree planting. Obviously, this is not as good as reducing our carbon footprint or changing the system, but it is something we can do immediately. Some of these programs, particularly the large corporate ones, have been criticized because they don't necessarily achieve the goal that they're setting out to. But some of the smaller programs are independently certified. Look for that kind of certification if you do a search online. So this is a good tool to use to do what you can quickly and then maybe move on and focus on the political challenges. All right, So thank you for walking through these steps with me. As people have noted, the political process may be more important, but for us, we have found that taking some of these steps help to empower us to do other things. And so it's helpful to kind of feel like you're walking the talk and doing a little bit in your own life. We haven't done all of the things that we talked about, but we are working towards them over time. Now, I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle to bring us back to the big picture and to wrap up today's talk.
Thanks, Brian. So true. We can all work to reduce our own carbon footprint, but we can't get to net zero unless we change the rules of the game. So I'm turning back to the piece written by the culture columnist and critic at the LA Times, Mary McNamara, for one last quote. We all need to vote and agitate as if our lives depended on it, because they do. And we need to remind ourselves of this on a daily basis. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. And thanks to Nevada Marches Forward for putting together this entire education series and for inviting us to speak with you today. We covered a lot of ground in a really short period of time. First, we looked at the nature of the problem, which is big. Then we went on to face the fact that the system itself needs to change. We discussed different things we can do to change the system, that we indeed must do to change the system. And we discussed, I'm sorry, of course, in this election year, it's critical that we elect climate champions who have a plan to get us to net zero. So that's job one. We also acknowledged that our personal choices and habits create a carbon footprint. So we looked at changes we can make to reduce our own impact. There's been a lot of good suggestions in the chat. I so appreciate you sharing with us some of your experiences. And since we have given you some time to create your own personal plan, I hope that you will act on it when you get off this call or when you get up tomorrow morning. Would anyone like to share more of those reflections or some of their own personal experiences on the path to decarbonization? Or does anyone have any questions?
Looks like we have a raised hand from Jane Grossman.
Hi, this has been so excellent. Thanks, Michelle and Brian. So much. I've been typing like crazy, and Tina, hopefully we'll catch all these links in case people haven't been copying them. Can you say again what the extra is that you pay if you sign up for NV Energy's green energy program? I didn't catch that.
It varies. I believe this year it's around 2 cents, so it is a substantial increase. But on your overall household budget, it's not too huge if you have the income to cover it.
Mm-hmm.
It does vary. It's gone down this year. I think the incremental cost for them is going down. They base it on a lot of what they're paying for with that program is geothermal, which is more expensive than solar, but it provides baseload power that runs 24/7. So.
Great, thank you.
Looks like we've got a raised hand from Steve.
Thank you. I had asked a question in the chat about I have little ones and I would love to find a way to reduce my footprint when it comes to transporting them, but they're 10 and 12. And I don't think they go on a scooter or on the back of a motorcycle. So, and there was a comment about maybe public transportation, but when it comes down to getting my son to school at his middle school at 7 a.m., just what are my best choices? Is I guess what I'm getting at.
Well, I can tell you one of the things that we did when our kids were that age, because yeah, getting a middle schooler or a high schooler to school that early is really tough. So what we did is I would drop them off and then I would drop off the bikes their bikes and lock them up at school. And then when it was time to go pick them up, I biked and we all biked home together. So that's one option. The burden always falls on the parent, right? But I will say that I think it's paid off with our kids because biking seems normal to them now. Just like, we used to live in a city where taking public transportation was really super easy. And so that started to feel normal as well. And I want to address another question that you had in the chat. I'm pretty sure it was you about agriculture and our diet. So agriculture is 10% of the greenhouse gases, according to the US EPA's 2019 inventory. So agriculture, how we farm and what we eat has a big impact.
Well, thank you.
It does. It does. All righty. I'm going to be cognizant of everybody's time. We've gone a minute or so over. But I want to thank you all again for joining us for this great presentation. There's an old adage that says, think globally, but act locally. So I encourage you all to think about how you can reach your county commissioner, city councilman, state legislature. Most of them are very willing to talk to constituents and very happy to hear what you find important and then to act on that. So again, I encourage you to reach out to elected officials. And like Michelle said, vote in some climate champions so that we can address this head on and get to where we need to be. I'd also like to invite you to join us in May for our next presentation on the intersections of gender-based violence. It's on May 10th from 6 to 7 p.m. And please look for the event on our website and our Facebook page. Again, thank you for being here. Great to see everybody, and I'm really glad to see so many people interested in climate change. And I wish you all a great evening. And thank you, Brian and Michelle, for such a great presentation.
Tina, quick question. Will we be able to share this presentation afterwards?
I believe we will be. It's being recorded right now.
Right.
Yeah. So. All right. Thank you again, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.
Have a
Thanks,
good night.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.